Well, good afternoon. Welcome on this one more lovely New Haven day. Welcome to the Whitney and Betty McMillan Center for International and Area Studies. I'm Charlie Hill. I've been teaching here for a long time and once was in the American Foreign Service where I watched our honored guest at work. So I'm filling in for Ian Shapiro, who is now teaching a class. And Ian, as I'm sure most of you know, is a Sterling Professor of Political Science and the director of the Henry R. Luce Center, where we are right now. And Ian will be joining us whenever his students will untie him and let him go. Today we are welcoming Senator Richard Lugar as this year's George Herbert Walker Jr. Lecturer. The Honorable George Herbert Walker III, Yale class of '53, our former ambassador to Hungary, established this lectureship in memory of his father, Yale College class of 1927. And Ambassador Walker and his family members are with us today. We want to welcome them. The Walker Lecture is really the signature lecture, the signature intellectual event of the McMillan Center, and this is such for 2014. And I've been at these lectures for a long time, going back to Madeleine Albright when she was here speaking when she was ambassador to the United Nations. Richard Holbrooke has been here. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, has been here. It's a very distinguished collection of major figures that have spoken here. Senator Richard Lugar is a fifth-generation Hoosier, longest-serving member of Congress in Indiana history. He is one of those guys who graduated first in his class everywhere, probably in kindergarten, in high school at Denison University, then was a Rhodes Scholar at Pembroke College, Oxford. He holds what must be getting close to the NCAA record of 46 honorary degrees from colleges and universities in 15 states. He's also a United States Navy veteran. He volunteered in 1957 and served as an intelligence officer for the Chief of Naval Operations, then Admiral Arleigh Burke. After a distinguished, and the record will show, a very innovative career in state and local government, Richard Lugar became a senator and has produced a record, I think, almost unmatched in American history of bipartisan achievementship. He really has won national and international distinction for the idea of working across the aisle. And in the context of today's Washington, he certainly stands as a paragon of what senatorial bipartisanship can really accomplish. He has been a major figure in the reduction of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. He forged the famous bipartisan arrangement with Senate Armed Services Chairman Sam Nunn of Georgia. And to date, the Nunn-Lugar program has deactivated more than 7,600 nuclear warheads that at one point were aimed at the United States. Beyond foreign affairs, as chairman of the Agricultural Committee, he built bipartisan support for federal farm program reforms, which ended the production controls of the 1930s, increased farm exports, raised net farm income. He's also put forward initiatives to streamline the Department of Agriculture, reform the food stamp program, preserve the school lunch program, the federal school lunch program. And today he is president of the Lugar Center, an organization, nonprofit organization, focusing on nuclear nonproliferation and food security. And he is, I understand, in the process of creating the Lugar Academy at the University of Indianapolis, which will link students of Indiana and the region to Washington policymakers. And he is professor and distinguished scholar at the new International School of Global and International Affairs at Indiana University. So it's quite a record. Senator Lugar's topic today will be Modern American Foreign Policy in an Uncertain World. So please welcome Senator Lugar.
Thank you. Charles, thank you so much for your thoughtfulness as well as for your great academic career. What an honor it is to be in the Millen Center, to be the friend and the lecturer tonight for Mr. Burt Walker, to be with each of you on this great campus. I want to take the opportunity tonight really to give a foreign policy talk, which I think will be somewhat different, but hopefully entertaining and enlightening, and will stimulate some of your questions that will come at least at the end of my prepared remarks. Let me just say at the outset that I saw an interesting column today by David Brooks in the New York Times. David Brooks, writing about the frustration that so many Americans have with American leadership, was helping young people to define how they might enter into more effective leadership. One of the things he suggested was that at some point fairly abruptly they go abroad. They leave America. They take a look at this country from an entirely different perspective, the rest of how the world looks at it. And then they come back and at least see America in a different light, hopefully in one that inspires them to take chances, to enter politics, to become involved really in public life. It was an exciting column. And I mention it because I am indebted to Charles for his introduction of some of the things that I've been involved in, but they really started with the thought after I graduated from Denison. I had never been abroad, had the opportunity through the Rhodes Scholarship to go to Oxford, went over on the boat with the 31 other Rhodes Scholars, went to Pembroke College, only American in the place, managed to get the porter to let me in that night with my baggage. And it was a revolution in my mind. I began to see how big the world was, how many talented people there are, how many dangers as well as possibilities. There were people there on that campus, not only from the British Isles, but from all over Europe, from Russia, from the African states, a number of young people really emerging who were going to play significant roles really in so-called underdeveloped countries. It led me really to travels that I had never contemplated before, and also to go to the American Embassy in London toward the end of my 2-year tenure at Oxford and volunteer for service in the United States Navy because I was convinced really that I had not only an obligation to my country, but likewise that this was likely to be once again sort of a revolutionary experience, and indeed it was. I had no idea that Admiral Arleigh Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, was trying to set up a briefing theater in the E-ring of the Pentagon where the so-called Navy point of view would be presented. His rival, Curtis LeMay of the Air Force, he felt was getting too much attention, and so he plucked out of obscurity a young ensign moving on to JG to be one of the intelligence briefers, my responsibility to come in at midnight every night, read the secrets of the country. Ultimately, by 6:30, the other admirals wanted my notes because Arleigh Burke had sometimes a tendency to send carriers the other way around the Cape of Good Hope or some radical move of that variety, and they wanted to be prepared for this. it was an awesome experience because I was sent then to see Alan Dulles at the CIA, to go to the NSA at that stage of its development, on occasion even to the White House, where I never saw President Eisenhower face to face, but was in a briefing theater that FDR had used with all the graphics and so forth. A very heady business for a young guy. I came back to Indianapolis to save the family farm and our family manufacturing business, but after a while we managed to save that and became involved in politics in Indianapolis. And to make a long story short, Richard Nixon made his first trip outside of Washington to Indianapolis. John Lindsay had gone Democrat. I was the last Republican mayor of a large city. And Nixon was not keen on going out into the country. Vietnam protesters and others were giving him fits. But he did come. He brought a lot of the cabinet with him. He was palpably relieved after the ceremonies out front of the city-county building with sharpshooters all around and so forth, and said, Lugar, I want you and Moynihan to go to Brussels, represent the United States at a conference on cities they're going to do. I happily accepted that responsibility as the young mayor of Indianapolis, went with Pat Moynihan, who became a very dear friend for the rest of our lives together. And I had the temerity, all the mayors of the world to come to Indianapolis the next year for an international conference on cities. Well, this was startling for my constituents as well as the mayors, but 50 or 60 came. Plane loads of people from Europe, from Asia, from South America, and so forth. They revived the various ethnic groups in Indianapolis who had not seen anybody from the various states of Yugoslavia or elsewhere for years. And likewise, sort of set the city onto a course of thinking internationally. The fact that if we were going to prosper, we would need to have not only exchange students coming and going, but business people coming and going, people in public life coming and going from an interior Midwest state. I mention all of this because by the time I got to the Senate, I was well prepared for what I hope would be the case, membership on the Foreign Relations Committee. And this was a period of over 3 decades of very exciting experiences, year by year, almost week by week, all over the world. I start in this way because I am hopeful as I visit with young people, and we're bringing some to Washington to be interns in our office, but more often we're on college campuses, to say that this is the excitement of living in this world today, the ability really to see the possibilities, but to do it firsthand, really on foot, very modest experiences, sort of building to a point where you could make a difference. Mention has been made of the significant program that Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia, he certainly had some important ideas at a crucial time in American history. I was very delighted to be his bipartisan partner. It was an improbable situation that we would ever meet around a table, which I've rolled down to my Lugar Center now, with Russians who came to us at the breakup of the Soviet Union. These were people that we had met for 5 years, starting with disarmament conferences in Geneva, Switzerland. So we had not necessarily a friendship, but we had a trust in each other. And the Russians actually said to us, we are bankrupt. We are breaking down any possibilities of security around the nuclear weapons that are aimed at you. And you better be conscious of that, because if we can't control that, who knows really what might happen. No accidents during the so-called period of mutually assured destruction, which for 40 years we all went through and maybe took for granted, but couldn't be taken for granted then. We said, what do you want? And they said, we want your money. We want a lot of it. As a matter of fact, we need your technicians to begin to pull all this stuff apart. We may even need some of your troops by the time we're done. And so that was the beginning of the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which became at least a focus for me for the next 20 years, year in and year out, with the appropriations necessary to get the money to do the things, with travels all over Russia. The first trip that President Obama took was during his first year in the Senate, when he came to me and said, "Dick, I know you go to Russia every year. I want to go with you." And Barack and I went to Russia. We're detained, in quotes, in Perm. A very strange situation in which they felt, I think, that I was a spy, and our plane was a spy plane. And we were being defended by the Ravens and so forth. This was at least a time in which I had a chance to continue to size up the world in some of the more dangerous places each year. Now, this leads me to try to formulate an idea about foreign policy tonight, which maybe is a little bit different. Sometimes we talk in terms of our own economy, and this has been especially true in recent weeks, about the large balance sheet the Federal Reserve Board has been building up, and whether it should be tapered, with the idea that somehow fewer government bonds are going to be purchased by the Fed each month. Very controversial situation, but nevertheless one in which most of the public now, when they hear balance sheet, thinks of the Federal Reserve Board and how big it is, and without knowing exactly what this means. But let's take a look at the balance sheet of the United States tonight with regard to foreign policy. I would start by saying that essentially the United States has by far the largest military budget of any country in the world. That has been true for many years. It's needed to provide at least the pay, not only for current active personnel, but likewise for veterans, for all the development of arms, as well as the maintenance of the ones that we have, for all of the troops that we have abroad who are at war or trying to maintain the peace, as the case may be. We have, as a part of that balance sheet, ships that patrol the high seas. The only country in the world that literally can send ships everywhere. And we do send ships everywhere. During our so-called new pivot strategy in Asia, we are sending many more aircraft carriers and other warships into the South China Sea and around the Philippines and elsewhere. This is not a well-publicized situation. Even the Senate, to my knowledge, has never been very well briefed on all the nuances of the pivot. I went out to Hawaii to talk to the Pacific Command and then to Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia to get some sense of all of this. Went on board the USS George Washington in the Manila Harbor and saw what a huge aircraft carrier that is, the implications of all of that as it cruises around for 6 months before they take 6 months of leave. We are the country that keeps the sea lanes open for foreign trade. The possibilities that there would be more foreign trade, there would be more liberal policies, are impossible, really, without this force that is at sea in the case of the United States fleet. We have troops that have been now in Europe in the tens of thousands ever since World War II. Ditto in Asia ever since World War II. We have recently sent a few hundred more troops to Australia as a part of the pivot, for example. In essence, these are forces that have been on the ground. They make a huge difference in terms of not only our power, but the strength of the NATO alliance, for example. If we've been talking about the history of American foreign policy, we'd be talking about wars in Europe back and forth for centuries. And here now we have the NATO organization, which is not only held together, even though the countries we believe do not provide enough money in their defense budgets. They have sent volunteers to Afghanistan simply to be by our side. And we take seriously the problems of countries that are close to the former Soviet Union, now to Russia. Article 5 has held. And as a matter of fact, when we were attacked on 9/11, all of the countries of NATO invoked Article 5 and said, we're coming to your aid. A very, very important development. In Asia, a much smaller devotion there internationally, but recently with the CETA organization, with APEC, with others, we have become much more active, much to their desire, much friendlier relations, as a matter of fact, I found this time around in Japan, in the Philippines, in Indonesia in particular, Thailand, not ambivalent, but a difficult role between China and the United States, and as they try to play it down the center. And as I learned from their ambassador at lunch not too long ago, they have their own political problems, which you read about daily in the paper. I would just say that we have, in addition to all of that, more nuclear weapons still than any other country in the world. Russia, a fairly comparable number. We have both decided, as a matter of our own security as well as the security of the world, that the reduction of these weapons through successive treaties was very, very important. The last one being the New START Treaty, which brings down, ideally, the number of warheads on both sides to less than 1,800. Possibly it'll turn out to be less than 1,500. There were still smaller nuclear weapons, theater size and so forth, lots of other problems of that sort. But this is a very big difference from a time in which it was reported, informally at least, that both of us had well over 10,000 warheads aimed at each other. It's an interesting fact in my life, as I look back on it, that all the time I was mayor of Indianapolis, it never occurred to me that there might be one or more of those warheads aimed at my home city that I was attempting to serve and to turn things around. It was a shock when I was out in Siberia one time. We had seen missiles come out of silos. I went down into one of these silos, 13th floor, and there was a desk there where essentially the guards had stood duty. And on the walls all around were pictures, beautiful pictures of American cities, which the guards believed were the targets of the 10 warheads on this one missile, the multiple delivery situation. This led me to find out, was Indianapolis ever targeted? You bet it was. So was every large city in the United States, and just every military installation. When we're talking about mutually assured destruction, this was not simply a phrase crafted by somebody for some rhetoric. It was a deliberate design on the part of both of our countries to target about everything in sight in terms of military or population that would annihilate the other. Now, somehow we got through this period of time, ignorant as I was as mayor of Indianapolis that I might see the whole thing blown up while I was there. We're beyond that point, thank goodness, but not home free. And I mention this because there is always trouble as you discuss this New START Treaty or any other treaty in which some members of the Congress and the public still take the position what we should have had all along was a comprehensive missile defense system that, in essence, you don't worry about arms control and you don't worry about destruction of these missiles. You just simply set up something so that if somebody shoots at you, it's shot down. Well, a long time ago, Ronald Reagan decided this was bogus, and we got off of that hook. We still have some members of Congress that are on that hook, and they want to keep every one of our weapons. As a matter of fact, want to spend $7 or $8 billion refurbishing all of them. Sometimes this is parochial politics out of Oak Ridge or out of New Mexico or so forth. But these are still serious debates as a part of this balance sheet of having the most nuclear weapons. I would say in addition to that we have the ability in this country to produce not only food for our population, but for some time we have been able to produce food to try to feed a great number of people throughout the world. This, many people point out, usually not glibly, but as a part of their presentation, is a real problem. If we have 8 billion people in the world now, people say, well, by 2050, probably 9 billion. Often 840 million people are mentioned each day as chronic challenged in terms of food to the point of being close to starvation at any one point. So this is a huge problem worldwide. But the United States, with our food production situation, and I don't want to get into an entirely different argument today by mentioning that I'm a strong proponent of genetically modified seed because we use this on our farm. When my dad was getting 50 bushels to the acre as I was a boy pulling volunteer corn out of the soybean field. I like to relate now that we got 191 bushels on our farm this year of corn per acre. We have to, in the same land, same number of acres, we've got to do this really all over the world if we're going to make a difference. It's huge, but we start from a very strong start. And finally, after many, many debates on trying to gain a degree of energy independence, we are finally producing gas, natural gas, a lot of it. We're producing much more oil, as a matter of fact. We are on the threshold of becoming the largest energy producer in terms of natural gas and oil in the world. That's a huge difference if you're looking at your balance sheet on the asset side, because food and fuel, any way you look at it in this world, are basics of foreign policy. People will fight before they starve, and they may fight if they don't have energy for their populations. So we have at least a lot going for us. But on the other hand, other side of the balance sheet, we are still involved in war in Afghanistan. We have at least terminated war in Iraq. The war in Iraq clearly started under considerable controversy. And each one of us who talks about these things really bears some responsibility, as I do. I was on the Foreign Relations Committee, was privy really to much of the intelligence, had to cast votes that were critical at various junctures in this situation. But the United States had not been without problems before the 9/11 attack. After all, we had fought in this century, or last century, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and so forth. Nevertheless, there was a certain quiet period in which this attack of 9/11 really came out of the blue, to say the least. Maybe almost as striking as the Pearl Harbor attack that I heard about on the radio as was driving along as a boy in Indiana. I would just say that at this point, there had, in fairness, been at least an attack by United States forces in Afghanistan on what we felt was an al-Qaeda camp. So this was not totally beyond our purview of our intelligence sources, but it was not a significant attack, and we really didn't know exactly what happened at that point. Well, we began to find out in a hurry, and before long, we were sending troops to Afghanistan, beginning a war that continues in that country even as we speak this evening. In addition to that, we had already been involved in warfare involving Iraq and its invasion of Kuwait. I remember very well debates that went on at that point in which then President Bush was asked, why are we in a war? And he said, well, we are fighting aggression. We cannot allow aggression by a state like Iraq. James Baker, maybe in a candid moment, said oil. Both had something going for them in terms of those arguments, because it led to our hearings in the Foreign Relations Committee that revealed, as we should have known, that clear back in the 1930s, the Roosevelt administration had been dealing with the Saudi monarchs. And it was valuable to both sides. For the United States, the idea was that the Saudis would be responsible for producing the oil that we needed. We didn't have enough, even in those days, and we needed a source of supply that was constant and certain. On the other hand, the Saudi monarchs wanted our assurance that they were going to stay monarchs, that that regime would, as a matter of fact, continue to prevail against all comers. And this was a deal that, as our Foreign Relations Committee hearings often pointed out, cost maybe about $500 million a year over the years, because it meant really constant deployments and intervention in the Middle East to keep the Saudis safe and to keep the oil lanes going, both. This was very critical for our security. Well, in any event, when Kuwait was invaded, the Saudis were not really sure whether they wanted American troops on Saudi soil, quite a debate there. And some would say the fact that we did have troops there, maybe for too long, led to some spur to the al-Qaeda movement in Saudi Arabia. Whether that's the case or not, we did push back the Iraqis. but they were on our minds. And when rumors floated around that they were developing a nuclear weapon, or maybe even were beyond that point of having one, this led then to a call for the end of Saddam Hussein and the end of that regime that was creating this sort of a problem. Now, as it turned out, we all know they didn't have the weapon at that point, but at the same time, I can remember vividly the military testifying, quite apart from the administration, that if we didn't move at the particular time of year that we moved, the weather was really going to turn very badly for us. It would not be nearly so propitious later on. And in essence, we went to war. As it turned out, we didn't have the weapons, but fairly rapidly we terminated the regime of Saddam Hussein. It began really a sort of a streak in American foreign policy, which was expressed again and again during the recent Arab Spring situation. In the same way that we felt the Iraq dictator needed to go, we felt likewise that the dictator in Tunisia, and then Libya, and then Egypt, now in Syria, almost glibly must go. And just very clearly, these folks don't belong in a world in which we're a country for democracy, for human rights, for rights of women, for development of children, and so forth. But in any event, he was overthrown. This led to Americans sort of coming to grips for the first time, I believe, with how many Shiites and how many Sunnis there are in the world, how many there were in Iraq in particular. And after you got through the Sunni Shiite business, how did the Kurds fit into this? With all the oil in the north, without a particular relationship either of the two major groups. It was our feeling that essentially the way out of this was democracy, the development of institutions that would lead to elections, would lead to a parliament and a prime minister or some executive legislative responsibilities. And furthermore, this became a goal of at least a portion of American foreign policy leaders, that this would set a model of democracy in an area that didn't have very much democracy. The idea was that democracies don't attack other democracies. If you had a Middle East setup of democracies, finally, we might come to an end to this racial warfare and to all the rivalries that had been there. Well, it was an important dream, but never beyond that, because at this time we finally got to a stage where it looked as if an election might be held. We saw the Sunnis in Anbar and elsewhere, where they are still very active today, coming out of the woodwork, and we managed to arrive at least some accommodations. We had the so-called surge. I remember being called to the White House. The president personally wanted to talk to John Warner and me because he felt we might be a little bit skittish about the surge, I guess. But anyway, we went through the surge and felt we were winning the war. And we had an election. Maliki did not have a majority, the Shiite who finally has prevailed. But the Sunnis became a part of a coalition, and likewise the Kurds. But as a part of all of that, ultimately, Maliki said to us that you've got to get out of Iraq. We wanted to stay with at least 10,000, 15,000 troops remotely, much more remotely than the troops we've had in Europe since World War II, or in Asia since that period. But the Iraqis said no. And so at great expense, we withdrew everybody out of Iraq. Now, we could have predicted what occurred, but nevertheless, it has been very sad to witness. And presently, as you note, last year, over 8,000 Iraqis killed each other, and we're on track to at least have that many casualties this year between the Shiites and the Sunnis. They really have not come down into a situation in which they are able to get along. And the Kurds have gone their own way, and some are involved with Syrian Kurds and others, and the Turks up in another part of the area. So that after all of the sacrifice of Americans, both in terms of blood and treasure, we have a very, very difficult predicament. This is, of course, a prelude to my thoughts about Afghanistan. Before the election of Barack Obama, I can remember very bitter colloquies between the leadership in the House and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee people about the Iraq and Afghanistan situation. Essentially, Democrats harpooned Republicans by saying, Iraq is your war, your Republican war, and we want out of it as fast as we can. We've got polls that show that 85% of the American public want to get out of there tomorrow. Afghanistan is the war we should have been in. This is our war, and so forth. In any event, Barack Obama won. He had a meeting, I remember vividly, at the White House, invited about the same people who had been involved in the previous conversation. And he said, I have good news for you. We are going to withdraw from Iraq by the end of this calendar year. Well, this enraged his Democratic supporters, who said, now. That was what the election was about, not a year from now, out now. That's the Republican war and so forth. Well, the president maintained at least his grace, and we left after a year, but we left. There was nobody out there. With Afghanistan, the war that Democrats, at least in that meeting, wanted to continue to fight, why we went on and on and on, and now we're at a point in which the debate is how many troops we get in Afghanistan to stay after 2014. We've been trying to get the president of the country to agree. He has not said he would. Said he wants to have another election in the country before we ever get to that point. It's a situation in which, as people talk to the Afghan villages and various others, they say, don't leave us. Because, first of all, we're likely to have more conflict, if not with the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or other associated terrorists. We're likely to have problems in our own situation. You've helped us set up schools for children. You have made possible rights for women in this country. All this is going to go. And so as a result, a good number of Americans say we really can't turn our backs on things that are so important to us: democracy, human rights, women's rights, children's rights. But at the same time, polling once again in the country shows between 75 and 85% of the American people want out. They're tired of the whole business, feel that the government there is unsympathetic, and as a result, that we've done our part. So this is a liability on that side of the situation. Now, in addition to that predicament, we have, of course, a whole host of situations going out of the Arab Spring business. The Sunnis and the Shiites going to war using not only Syria, whether Assad must go or not, as a battleground to fight out the desires of the Saudis or the Iranians on one side, with the Iraqis now sort of siding with at least the Shiite part with the Iranians, others in the UAE and so forth helping out on the Saudi side. A situation in which right now John Kerry, I saw in the press today, still hopes that there's going to be the beginnings of a peace conference, but he hopes some of the Syrians will attend, but it's not really clear who and exactly where that thing might go. And furthermore, even if they all attended, whether they can come to a truce, whether everybody agrees they want to lay down their arms. If you're a more volatile Shiite and you've come out to a fight in Syria, you're not really interested in the peace conference. There are so many people from other countries coming in and out of Syria. One of the problems that Europeans now tell us they're facing is some of the same sort of thing that we saw, sadly enough, say, at the Boston Marathon. You have people that are from countries, whether it be France, Germany, others, who are caught up with a religious fervor that comes from a Muslim temple, and they go out and fight, and they believe really it's their destiny to die, and maybe to do so suicidally. Well, some do that, but some come back to their countries each of these countries is now facing, how do you sort of screen out folks who have been heading out to Syria recently and wonder really what's ahead in each of these cases. Well, these are problems that we have been facing as a country. Great argument in our own country as to whether the president's policy with regard to non-intervention, aside from humanitarian services, occasional arms on the periphery to various groups, the diplomatic conferences we now have, very, very tough row to hoe, to say the least, and unlikely to go away very rapidly. I would say in addition to that we still have the problems with Iran and North Korea and nuclear weapons. Those negotiations with the Iranians may work out. In my own view, as I've given, is that we ought to give diplomacy a chance. But as all of you have read, there are at least a majority of members in the United States Senate presently who want to pass additional sanctions against Iran to try to make life more difficult for the Iranians, and certainly make it more difficult for John Kerry or anybody else who is trying to bring about diplomacy out there. The president claiming he'd veto all of this, but the number of Democrats adding to the almost unanimous feeling of Republicans who may be just trying to cause some trouble for the president make this a very, very tenuous predicament, to say the least. And so we sort of keep our fingers crossed with regard to all of that. I mentioned these all as background for the fact that even if we brought solutions to this, there are now increasingly in countries throughout northern Africa, as well as the Middle East, terrorist groups. We're all familiar with Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab and others, but others that really come out of religious feelings, out of all sorts of reasons. And this has led to some challenges that each one of you may have views about. For example, as opposed to having troops on the ground, as we have had in Iraq and Afghanistan, some have suggested our better bet is to use intelligence services, intelligence cooperation with other countries, and then to send drones in to do the attacking, as opposed to having battalions of troops. That our best bet really is to isolate the terrorist leadership or various folks that intervene here, because there are so many countries, so much space, and yet usually people who are willing to work with our intelligence sources to do this. Now, one difficulty, and the Pakistanis point this out vividly all the time in arguments, is that a lot of the drones have been hitting in Pakistan. They say this violates our sovereignty. You've never declared war precisely, but then that's the predicament of our new foreign policy. There isn't a nation-state situation. You have individual persons floating back and forth who are of menace to various countries, including our own. So in any event, we are developing more and more drone capability, but we can anticipate others are going to also. In the future, we will not have a monopoly on this particular situation. Even as we're thinking about drones and intelligence, we ought to be thinking much more in our foreign policy about cyber warfare. Now, cyber warfare is beyond my ability to describe. I can barely use my iPhone successfully. But nevertheless, there are people in this world who can describe at least how you would shut down a banking system. Or even if you didn't shut down the whole system, you might come to New Haven and shut down all of the telephones and all of the emergency situations in the hospitals and lots of other services, and create enormous problems and suffering for people, quite apart from a comprehensive national attack. We're really on the sort of a threshold of trying to come to grips, given this electronic age and the new communication devices that we have, as to how powerful they are. I was in a conference recently that the think tank CSIS produced in preparation for what used to be called the Verkunda Conference in Munich each year, the security conference there. And one of the great preoccupations, of course, in Munich is Angela Merkel feeling her telephone has been tapped, and the difficulties of our negotiations with the Germans, in which we bring up about everything in the world, and they bring up Angela Merkel's telephone. The question is, what is the scope of NSA? What is the scope of commercial agencies around the world who have gone well beyond NSA in terms of their sophistication? NSA barely taps in to how well Google functions or various others, as a matter of fact. What should be in our country the criteria for so-called privacy, quite apart from the privacy for Angela and the world out there? But this is the world in which we live, in which even if we don't shut down people's system, we are going to be accused of reading all of their mail and of looking at their telephone conversations. A very different predicament, to say the least. I would say, in addition to that, we will face, as I mentioned earlier, the food and fuel crisis again and again. The case can be made that one of the greatest predicaments that Mubarak had in Egypt was not the Muslim Brotherhood, but it was the problem of feeding people back in the hustings. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, who were prepared to fight and die before they starved. And this again and again is going to be the case around the world. How do we get into food production? And then, very complicated case all by itself, how do we develop more and more of a world trade system without barriers? Barriers for food, barriers for energy. It's very trying right now for our government attempting to formulate new trade negotiations with Europe and with Asia, and not knowing whether the Congress has any spirit whatever to deal with this particular thing this year, even if it's rather crucial in the world, to move these goods and services for our own benefit, for our own jobs and prosperity, as well as for the rest of the world, but in the critical issues of food and fuel, absolutely vital in terms of our foreign policy and security. So these are very, very important issues. And finally, I mentioned a subject that would be consuming us all for a long while, climate change. I don't ask for anybody to adopt any particular doctrine with regard to this. I was reminded as I flew into the New Haven airport here today, saw how close to the waters are a number of houses there, of articles that run rampant in our papers almost weekly, of the fact that whatever reason could be produced by nature itself, quite apart from man, the waters are rising. Those people are going to be in jeopardy. If you have at least a little bit of bad weather, a lot of jeopardy. We've already had a little bit of this in the United States. I've gone to conferences in which I was told as a public official, it was my responsibility, whether you believe in climate change or not, to map out for your own hometown, your own home state, how you're going to rescue people, how the hospitals are going to work, how physically the roads are going to work. In other words, this is going to happen, and it's going to happen in many places, not just the seacoast, but where you have rivers or lakes or so forth in this country, quite apart from parts of the world even more vulnerable, and which is widely predicted. They already are facing this. We don't know what the melting of ice in the Arctic means. It could be warfare, as people try, in fact, to claim all the rights underneath the sea that they've already felt that they had. No fixed boundaries there, and the United States are unwilling to get into treaty negotiations in terms of law of the sea. But these are on the horizon, leaving aside war in Iraq or Afghanistan. These are questions that aren't nation states versus nation states, but they're states of the world in which we live, of nature, of food and fuel and so forth, that really we can meet, but we are going to need extraordinary cooperation within our country, as well as very, very active diplomacy in the world. And I applaud our Secretary of State, John Kerry, with whom I worked, and our Vice President, Joe Biden, who was out there all of the time. Our Chuck Hagel is now Secretary of, these were all comrades for years, sitting together for the hearings, for a learning experience in the Foreign Relations Committee. I think they're doing a good job. And I would just say that I applaud the attempts of the Obama administration to invigorate international trade. very vital for us and for everybody else, given all the barriers, all the protectionist elements that are not just in this country, but all over the world. And finally, we get back to the fact that we really do need to continue to promote our ideals of democracy, of human rights, of women's rights, of rights of children. It may not be that we are going to be able to stay and simply reorganize Iraq or reorganize Afghanistan. But nevertheless, through exchanges of students and exchanges of adults, business people, of diplomats, of everybody, so that we get to know each other. The same revelations I had when I first went abroad, I'm sure are repeated again and again by people of all ages who move, who have some idea of how big this world is, how dangerous, how complex. These are people then with whom we can deal, that we have a much better audience in terms of our own ideals and our own progress. So let me conclude by saying that we start with a balance sheet in which we have very, very strong assets, a lot going for us, to say the least. We have a balance sheet of liabilities or potential dangers that is very significant, not overwhelming, but ones that are going to require very active, intelligent, forceful American advocacy and staying power. I'm excited about those possibilities. We are not in a world war, thank goodness. We're not in mutually assured destruction. We are in a situation in which we could move if we are inclined to do so. And I applaud this center for all the encouragement it gives to people young and old to think about the world, to think as human beings about each other, to act in humane and active, intelligent ways. And I thank you so much for the honor of giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Senator Lugar can take a couple of questions before we would move to the reception. So, what was yours? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Senator Lugar. My question is, how can U.S. foreign policy adapt to meet an emerging China? So particularly a China which will become the world's largest economy very shortly.
I believe that we are making progress in our conversations with Chinese leadership, as well as with those who are not in leadership. Let me point out that even a short time ago, when a Chinese leader came to Washington and I had a chance to ask, who is commander-in-chief in your country? And he sort of smiled wanly and said, well, the Communist Party. He didn't say he was. Now we're moving toward a situation, I believe, in China, in which the president or the chief executive officer really is going to be in much greater control of the military. Now, some people find this to be alarming. They would say China is about the same stage as Japan was about 10 or 20 years before Pearl Harbor. But others would say that, as a matter of fact, China is aggressive with regard to the South China Sea and various other push and pull maneuvers. But finally, we are having more conversations between our military and theirs. We're having more conversations at all levels with Chinese leadership. Thank goodness more American business people are in China actually producing goods and services and vice versa. The number of students coming here to Yale as well as to Indiana University and what have you from China, enormous, thank goodness. So at least not necessarily be persuaded by what we're doing, but imbibing in the culture. In other words, we have lots of opportunities to let diplomacy work. And I'm confident that we're going to take advantage of those, but we need to talk about it frequently so that there are not miscalculations. And that the growth of China and all the people of China toward more fuel, more food, more opportunity moves right along with our own. And that we keep at least a situation of transparency with each other.
Sir?
There were a number of folks, as the Iraq war was winding down, that felt that there shouldn't be a unified government, but that it should be divided into a Sunni Shiite, Kurd, provincial kind of unified basis. And we see with the deterioration of the single government right now that perhaps that's where it's going anyway after a period of time. And one could look at Syria and a couple other countries and say, maybe they're doomed too. And so the question to you is, how do you feel about abandoning sort of the country-style approach that we have right now, that we've got to preserve Iraq or preserve Syria as they're currently set up on the map, and go to a different viewpoint of those countries and go back to tribal or regional aspects of government?
Well, as you remember, Vice President Biden, who was then chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, suggested that kind of division. We had public hearings on it. It was widely condemned at the time, and maybe at that time it appeared that we felt the elections were going to proceed, that a coalition could occur, that cooperation with the Kurds in particular for the oil and the resources there was necessary. But in any event, you're right that the idea has reappeared in Syria, because it's not really clear that the Alawites are going to be able to prevail and continue to rule as they have with 10% of the population. It's not really clear at the end of the day whether some of the boundaries drawn by Europeans after world wars that define really where these countries are appropriate, given the divisions that have come up subsequently or even were there then that might not have been observed. And so I'm not one that's advocating at this point drawing of lines. I don't have a map in which I think we could work this out. But I think it's an idea that we have to retain at least some openness to how pragmatically boundaries might occur or groups of people might find each other so that it is not a question of one group trying to annihilate the other or subject them to tyranny, only to be overthrown by the other as they have opportunities and allies, and now with a situation in the Middle East in which other countries are coming in to playground the whole situation, and simply because they have very strong religious convictions or they have a sense of adventure. So this is, seems to be on the table as they get into the discussions about the future of Syria in particular.
On a more political note, after you left the Senate, your PAC gave lots of money to Republicans who are facing challenges from the right, but you also gave money to Michelle Nunn in Georgia, who's Democrat, Sam Nunn's daughter. I was wondering if you see any hope for us moving away from the polarization in the Senate and moving back towards some more moderate candidates like that.
Well, I think we're all prayerful that this may occur some occasion, but I don't see it happening very soon. I think we are still in for a period of intense partisanship. And in part, this is because we have rearranged our country at various other levels. We have state legislatures that have redrawn congressional lines to create so-called safe districts. So that in essence, the battle is in the primaries, not in the general election, where independents or others might make a problem. And so, again and again, after you do that, and then you have the Citizens United case with regard to unlimited political spending, much of it anonymous, whether it be Club for Growth or Freedom Works or the Koch brothers or whoever else. You've got tens of millions of dollars sometimes coming in on a particular state, quite apart from what the people of that state are interested in, and influencing the television ads, the circulars, all the rest of it. This is a very different period of time in our political life, but it all tends to reinforce the situation so that members who are incumbents trying to guard their continuing in office are very much inclined to move very far right or far left, as the case may be, since that's where the decision-making is likely to occur. And then when they come to Congress and people have scorecards from each of the different groups as to how they behave themselves, they have this problem of self-preservation. So it's a tough time to be a member of Congress and to look across the aisle and to try to provide. And that's going to happen to get the 2/3 majorities that are necessary to overcome vetoes or to pass treaties, either one, or the 60 to overcome filibusters. Every day we're faced with that problem.
Time for one more, maybe? Yes.
Thank you, Senator, for your interesting conference. What's the influence of Yale University in people like you? Because you mentioned you went to the mayor meeting and then you invited them to come. Well, not Yale advising you. You mentioned you went to Russia, discussed with the journalists, and then you spent the money. So, what is the influence of the academia in people like you who are really driving international relations?
Oh, it's huge, because somebody really has to provide an education for us. In other words, somebody who actually knows something about the various countries we're talking about, from personal experience or from academic responsibilities, or just from debates that have occurred not just on campus, but through national associations and so forth. A very, very important part of my education at every point along the way, of people that I called in to try to offer advice, testimony, sometimes public testimony. We had, when I was chairman, constant hearings in the Foreign Relations Committee for the benefit of the members, but also for the public, for the press, for everybody else, to gain at least a degree of education and to be referred to the books of the scholars or their papers or various other things, really, for further reference. So this is an extremely important aspect, and I compliment the Macmillan Center again for providing such a great forum, one that has such energy and so many people participating at all ages.
We've come to a time when I think we can move to the reception in the common room on the second floor above, to which everyone is invited, and we can thank Senator Lugar for an amazingly comprehensive analysis of our international and political scene.
Thank you very much. Thank you.